So just for context, I invited Jason Rosen from Petal here because I've gotten the opportunity to see Jason and his role as CEO change a lot over time. Brooklyn Bridge Ventures led the first round of investment in Petal 2017?
End
18?
of 2016.
16, okay.
Yep.
And, you know, starting from, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 people to now Petal has how many employees?
200.
200 employees. I imagine the CEO job's a little different than when you started.
Changes quite a bit. It's the only job where the better you get at it, the harder it becomes. So you can never really get ahead. If you do a good enough job as a CEO, your job gets much harder.
There you go. And we're going to talk about some of the ways in which it gets harder, but also different over time. And we're going to talk about it chronologically. We're going to talk about the progression of the company and how the different functions have kind of started and evolved and what functions he's taken off his plate and you know, what are some of the keys to that. So Jason, maybe you could sort of start off with giving me a little bit, and we can dive into our document too. I'll share screen and Naomi will open that up. Can you give me a little insight into the pre-funding, the pre-pitch, like the part of the story that I wasn't around for? And can you talk a little bit about just like, what was that initial team like? And as the CEO, did it even actually, I'd be curious if it felt like you were CEO versus you were all just kind of had some stuff to work on and maybe it didn't quite feel like the company pre-funding yet. So what was your CEO job pre-pitch?
Yeah, well, I had some co-founders, and not everybody does. Some people will go through this phase on their own. And if you're completely by yourself, I'm not sure how much titles matter. But even among co-founders, we didn't figure out who would actually be the CEO for a while. I remember when we created the company legally, we had to write in, the different titles. And there was a period of time where my co-founder was formally listed as the CEO. And we kind of said, well, it doesn't really matter at this point. Let's just write something in and we'll figure it out later. And then at a certain point down the road, we had a conversation about, okay, who's going to be the CEO? But, it's kind of like, being a king of, a country that has no people in it. I'm not sure so much of what that title means. Like much of what you're doing at this stage, though, the title matters in that it gives some insight into the kind of company that you aspire to create, even if you haven't built anything or much of anything yet. I'd say that your job in this period of time, at least for us, was sort of defining a business plan and a product. It's a lot of research and learning and building of a strategy and a plan for what you want to do. There's also quite a bit of building a network, at least for us during this period of time, meeting the people in your industry, folks that have built companies, especially similar companies, getting advice, feedback, especially critical feedback of what you're thinking, challenges, and using all that to kind of forge a viable plan. None of that work is really what I would think of as CEO work, right? Very different from what you do once you have employees and funding and so on. So at this point, you're kind of a member of a team working on developing an idea. It's somewhat unique.
Your question about that, and it sounds like maybe it wasn't necessarily intentional not to pick the CEO right off the bat. You were just kind of doing other stuff, researching product, as you said, building the network. Do you think that actually had an impact on how you work together as a team? For example, like I could potentially see that being on one hand maybe more collaborative. That it doesn't feel like everyone's reporting to you in that situation. But also on the other hand, when you were doing this research, did you guys go out and individually represent the company? Did you parallel your research and talk to others, or did you kind of all show up as a group? Because one of the things I know some teams worry about is that everybody's off figuring out their own stuff, coming to their conclusions, and there isn't communication cohesion.
Well, I certainly agree with you first that hierarchy is not necessary at this stage in building the business. And I would say that for early stage companies, generally avoiding hierarchy for as long as you can is usually a good strategy. But if you have 2 or 3 people working on the project together, I don't know what it gets you to have like formal lines of reporting. So it is more collaborative, certainly among co-founders. If the situation is different and it's one founder and a couple of early employees, then maybe it's structured in a different way. My experience was a group of co-founders that had a good amount of kind of equality among us. And then in terms of the communication cohesion is the word that you use. This is a period of time when a co-founding group is really co-creating something. And I think forming a combined view of the world. You're collectively coming to a point of view about a problem and a particular solution and a plan forward. Certainly, to be successful, the co-founding group, if you have multiple co-founders, needs to get on the same page and have a common set of beliefs about what you're doing. And so I think that's developed over time. Did we have everyone in every single conversation? I'm sure we didn't. A lot of times we were in the same conversations with an industry expert or something like that. But if we weren't in the same conversation, we were then bringing back together what we learned and discussing it. It was a period of intensive collaboration, like spending, at least for us, it was spending every hour of the working day interacting with your co-founders and discussing what you were learning and your ideas and developing those things further. That foundation, I think, is critical at this point in time. Expect to work together really closely.
So you didn't necessarily do like stand-ups or formal, like, okay, now is our time to have the product meeting or the sales meeting, or did you? Was there structure to the communication early on?
I think there was, in that that group all felt that we needed to be in constant communication with one another. And, a lot of that was in person. This was obviously in the pre-COVID world. It helped that 3 of the co-founders all lived in the same neighborhood in New York, and so we literally were in the same physical space for many of those hours. And then we got into certain cadences that work for us. I don't think formality is necessary here, but you want to be a good partner to the other people that you're working with. And so, we were working at the same time, right? So like sort of define the workday in a similar fashion. We would exchange kind of collective to-do lists at this period of time. Here's all the things that I'm doing today. So that we had, kind of coordination among what was going on, and then lots of synchronous communication, in-person talking, calls, video chat, ad hoc, but it was kind of assumed at that point that, there were multiple conversations every day.
And any of the to-do lists or any of the materials of the company on any kind of platform that you found useful, or was the company just a big shared Google Doc at the time?
It was more the latter, but we use like a shared drive, and we've mostly used G Suite over time. Like we've used Box and Dropbox a little bit, but a shared place to keep all your files and notes and work product and so on. And certainly when you start building the product and actually like producing code, then there's a set of tools that you need as well. But sort of something like that for you to share your materials, I think is helpful. And then, we've always liked the G Suite because you can be collaborative as you develop something, as you write or produce a spreadsheet or whatever it is. On the design side, maybe Figma is the analog here. But tools where you can collaborate in real time from wherever you are very helpful for the kind of code development that I'm describing.
And how long before roles started to become, a little more structured? Because I feel like, maybe I'm misremembering, but I feel like I knew who the CEO was at the pitch. So somewhere along the line, you made some decisions about roles.
Right. One of our co-founders who joined said to us, "We got to figure out who the CEO is." I think there are a few outliers here where companies have made other structures work with co-CEOs, for instance, sort of like multiple people who are in charge, but that's the exception and not the norm. And there are a lot of reasons why having a single, tie-breaking vote or main spokesperson for the company makes sense. And so we had some pressure among the team to figure it out, that was the right thing to do. And I also would say that more on a functional basis, we all started gravitating towards different things. There's a lot to do during this period of time. And you do have to kind of begin to divide up the responsibilities. And on our founding team, at least, and I think this is a good characteristic of successful founding teams, we had a bunch of complementary skill sets. We all weren't overlapping in the things that we could do. So we had someone on the founding team who was much more oriented towards the financial side of things. We had someone on the founding team that was technical. We had someone on the founding team that kind of gravitated more towards the marketing side. And my role was a little bit more focused on strategy and product and positioning for the business, communicating the business, and then working with external parties. Those things matched up, I think, a little bit. Those matched up well with the typical CEO job description. And so what we had kind of formed was like a CFO type person, a CTO type person, a chief marketing officer type person, and then there was me, and the only thing left for me to do was be the CEO.
Sort of outside person.
Outside, but also I think probably driving a lot of our strategy and maybe like longer term vision.
Well, and I think to some extent, like every discussion about startups, there's a little bit of it depends, because you happen to be in the type of company that is built upon a lot of outside relationships. Yep. You had to secure financing, you had to secure credit relationships and clearing and all of that other stuff. Whereas if you were building the world's best iOS to-do list app, right, maybe the CEO would have been more of a product or technical person or more of the marketing person, because that would be the focus of the company.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's always helpful if the CEO has relevant skills. In Fintech, in particular, and for those that don't know my background, I actually began my career as a corporate lawyer, spent some time as a venture lawyer, and then got into startups. But I had legal training, and I had legal training with a specific focus on financial transactions and working with financial institutions, and so on. In fintech, which I think is an example of this, I really think there are three necessary components of building a successful financial technology company on a functional basis. You need the fin portion, which, for our business has to do with credit and lending. So you need people who have that kind of industry experience. You need the tech portion, right? So you have to be able to build the software, the models, whatever it is that's going to differentiate your company and create kind of a different approach or different value in what you're doing. Those two get the top billing in fintech, right? They're both referenced in the name. But in addition to those two, you need really strong regulatory, legal, and compliance understanding of what you're doing. That allows you to understand where you can innovate, where you cannot. It allows you to forge the partnerships that you need to build your business. It's just as important as those other two. And so within fintech, I think having a founder that has some special skills in one of those three areas can be really helpful. It's not a 100% requirement, but the fact that I had some insight into one of those three areas really helped. Just like it would have helped if I, let's say, came from banking or that I was technical. All of those things would give you an edge. Ultimately, as a CEO, you have to become a generalist. And I don't hold the legal function in higher regard just because I have that training. You actually have to understand a good amount of everything that's going on across the business and balance all the different needs and responsibilities and so on. But gosh, those early days, you only have a few people working for you, lots of stuff to do. You can get a head start in some of these areas if you have some pre-existing knowledge.
So let's make the next column sort of fundraising and seed stage, because we talked about beforehand, and your company's a little bit unique in the sense that there's a fair amount of standing up of the product that was sort of necessary. Like your startup company to launch a product was probably a little bit longer than somebody who's just coding some app on the weekend, because you have to put financing in place and all this sort of stuff. So for now, we'll just sort of think of this as the next stage, not being like beta product, but almost like beta company, where you're fundraising and then building the team and product during the seed stage. When you went to go fundraise, how does the role of the CEO work with the sort of rest of the team? And I'm particularly curious, some CEOs go out and do the whole raise, leave the rest of the team at home. They just hope that he or she comes back with some money, but it's very sort of cordoned off from the rest of the team. You had in our first meeting, one of your co-founders join. I don't know how that was like in every meeting. Obviously, there's still work to be done, so you don't want to distract the team. So I'm curious about how you leveraged the team or didn't during the fundraising process as CEO.
Yeah. And I do think that shielding the team to a certain extent from fundraising is usually a good idea. The fundraising process, Charlie, as you know intimately, is a bit of a roller coaster. There are ups and downs and disappointments and moments of excitement and risks and opportunities, and it's quite dynamic. And it's usually an extremely high leverage thing for the company, sort of determining what the next phase of the company will look like. Will we get the funding we need to go off and do the things we want to do? If we don't get the funding, the consequences are usually very severe. And so it's really high pressure. And just to be frank, you don't want to put everybody through that to the extent you can avoid it. Now, I always err, and this is maybe a learning over my tenure as a CEO. I always err on the side of transparency. And so my default is to share developments and learnings and important updates with the company, but not to share details that will be unhelpful. Sometimes you got to take some kind of responsibilities on yourself. The company usually knows when we're fundraising, but they don't need to deal with all of the ups and downs and disappointments and kind of small strategy that happens along the way. I also don't think it's a good idea to do it completely by yourself, lone wolf. One, going back to the emotional component that I mentioned, it's really helpful to have at least one other person going through it with you that you can commiserate with, and that can help kind of balance you out. I think I tend to be a little bit more emotional maybe than some of my co-founders, and I was very glad to have them involved to kind of even me out a little bit, and provide some perspective as you go through the process. There also is work to be done. And again, very small team at this period of time. Successful fundraise involves really thoughtful materials, a lot of practice in sort of how you'll answer questions and pitch the business, a financial plan that's credible. You have to be able to go through due diligence. And so you want to have support related to all those sorts of things. And further, like those materials go through iterations through a fundraising process too. And so you need to have the necessary bandwidth to do those iterations. So I kind of recommend a small group of people that can handle the ups and downs and being exposed to that overall process, and can kind of go through it together. With that said, you probably want to have very defined roles for who does what, and you don't want to be changing those roles frequently, because just like anything, you get better at fundraising over time. As you do it, you learn and improve, and repetitions really matter. Even if it's repetitions of being asked similar questions and being able to speak to investors' concerns or areas of ambiguity in a clear way. You kind of want to have the same people playing consistent roles so they can really refine those roles and get good at them.
Also, okay, now you've brought some money in, and you have a plan, and now that you actually have resources, I imagine things start to feel pretty real at that point, that you can actually sort of go forward and start to execute. What were some of the early management tools and processes that you used in that early sort of, right after you closed the seed? Did you change at all the dynamic of how you were working with your small initial co-founder only team as you started to, add on folks?
Right.
I mean, let's start, for example, with like organizing the team and communication.
As soon as you start to hire people, things change, and you have a whole set of obligations to those people that have taken a risk on you. And those early employees that join a company at this stage, they're some of the sometimes unsung heroes of these types of businesses. They take on a lot of risk as well. They don't have the same upside as a co-founder. They're really important, and can shape the direction of the company. So once you have employees, you've got real responsibilities to those employees. You have to think about all of your people and HR practices, right? So how you're going to compensate people in a fair way, how you're going to think about people's roles and responsibilities and their job trajectories, how those people will get management and guidance and coaching so that they do the right thing and they have opportunities to develop in their careers. There's a lot of those things that are necessary. And here, it does help to have, some reporting lines to determine who's responsible for what, who's going to make what decisions, et cetera. Something that's true across this entire document that we're developing together in the role of the CEO is that at the highest level, your job is to make sure that the company has the capital that it needs. So that's the fundraising portion, and then ensuring your company doesn't run out of money. So you get dollar money capital, and then you convert that into human capital, right? You convert that into people, into a team that can execute on your plan. And so, that's why, in this period of time, I think that the CEO's job is the principal recruiter for the business. I think that's one of the most important things that you're probably doing at this stage.
People.
Usually you don't have a head of people yet. And so
CEO, effectively the first head of people.
Essentially, definitely on the recruiting side. Maybe you share the responsibilities related to people operations, like running the payroll system. I don't know if the CEO has to do that. But in going out and finding the talent and enrolling those people in your mission for the company, you can't really delegate that. Even today at 200 people, you only delegate that so much. And I still am involved with a great deal of our recruiting. So that's an important component. And so you got the capital, you've converted that into a team, and then you want to set that team up to be successful. And that kind of gets me to your question.
Actually, real specifically, was that also the case in areas that you didn't necessarily have the background? So for example, like if you needed to make some technical hires, are you how involved are you in the recruiting process for an area whereby you're not a coder by training? I don't know, how knowledgeable enough you are to be dangerous in terms of evaluating a full stack developer's resume, but did you hand that off to your CTO, or you still is equally involved in the recruiting side?
If you look at the 200 people that work at Petal, I'm probably not qualified to hire any of them. Maybe a small handful of those people. But ideally, you're hiring folks that know their area of responsibility much better than you do. And so I think that you need to develop the ability to evaluate people that have a different set of skills from your own, no matter what background you have going into it. And you have to be aware of what you don't know. So as a CEO of the company, you're intimately involved in the company's culture and its sort of norms and the types of people that you're interested in hiring. And so in an interview context, no matter the background, let's say a technical hire, like you asked about, you can evaluate for culture fit, commitment to the mission, collaboration, communication. There's a lot of different things. And then there are technical components where, it's very clear that I can't evaluate a candidate. And there you make sure that you have the right expertise to do that, either internally or externally. But still involved in the hiring of everybody at this stage. There are CEOs that I know of businesses that are considerably larger than Petal that still interview a very high volume of the candidates for a job. I don't interview the majority of candidates for jobs at Petal anymore, and I'm proud of that. I view that as a feature that we've built an effective recruiting, hiring process that can maintain the standards and hire for the right culture without my direct involvement. But at this point, you should be involved. I'll give you an example. There was a period of time when hiring engineers was the most important thing for the company, as it is for a lot of companies at this stage. And I was meeting with engineering candidates as the first meeting that they would have with our company. Every single morning on my way to work, I would have at least one, if not multiple, hopefully often in-person meetings over coffee with engineering candidates. I could do a little bit of evaluation, but more than that, as well as anybody, I could communicate what the company was doing, why it matters, why they should be excited about working with us.
Gotcha. You started to have, more focused roles on the company. At this point, how many people did you get up to in the seed round, roughly?
I think that we were above 10,
Well,
probably
yeah,
between 10 and 20 by the time we hit the Series A.
gotcha. And so obviously not everyone is reporting to you. And how did you work with your direct reports? Did you have check-ins? Did you like what was the meeting dynamic and reporting dynamic around various teams?
Yeah. And, there's two ways that I can answer this question. I can tell you what
Well,
you
no,
should do.
truthfully.
Right. Well, I can tell you what you should do, and then I can tell you what I did. And, those are
That's
not
helpful. That's helpful to know.
right. So I didn't have much people management experience at this point. And I was very aware of that and insecure about that. By the way, another macro point. So, I made a first macro point, which is true across the board, that your job as a CEO, get capital, convert that into human capital, make sure those humans are set up to succeed. Another macro point, which is, I think, true kind of across the board as we talk about these sorts of things, that you as a CEO are not going to be managing people where you know how to do their job. Right? You are going to be managing people hopefully that know a lot more than you do. And so I think that's a challenge from a management perspective. And then the second thing is understanding, and this is maybe one of the most important macro points, understanding where you don't know how to do something is so critical. Having a keen sense of what you don't know, it can be one of your most potent weapons as a CEO. And I know that sounds strange, right? Understanding your own gaps and weaknesses. Yeah, absolutely. Because it will lead you to go outside and find the right expertise to make the right decisions. The inverse of that maybe expresses it more clearly. If you have a false sense of what you know, you're in for trouble, right? And so I knew that I didn't have much people management experience. And so I went out and I read a whole bunch of management books. And I talked to people about how to be an effective people manager. And I'll tell you, if you read enough management books, there's a certain point where there's diminishing marginal value. They all kind of start to sound the same. And I got to a point where I was like, okay, I kind of understand this. And so that gave you some frameworks, some kind of ideas of what a manager should do. And then, also bless my early direct reports. I think we had a lot of people on the team that managed up really well and said to me, hey, I've had a good manager before. Here are the things that manager did. And I said, oh, okay, why don't I try to do those things for you as well? Really tactically, weekly one-on-ones are really important at this stage, and where we currently are, more of a growth stage company. That's typically in 45 minutes to an hour with a direct report. And in those meetings, typically, and this hasn't changed very much over the years, you're talking about current priorities, progress against those priorities, any issues, problems, or blockers that have come up. And invariably, especially as the company grows, you're talking about people. Do we have the right resourcing? Are people on the team working well together? Are there people-related issues? So those four things. What are the current priorities? What's the progress against those priorities? Any issues or blockers, and people-related stuff.
Okay. Where did you feel like, in terms of either size or stage and function, that being a manager of this group leveled up next in terms of complexity?
So there's definitely a point where you're managing managers, where you have multiple layers in the organization. And I think that sort of a rule of thumb is that you can manage 6 people well. Maybe in the 4 to 8 people range. There have been periods of time where I've managed more as a CEO, including now. I think I might have more direct reports than that. I've heard of CEOs at certain periods of time managing 10 to 15 people. You should know that as you go above that 6 or 7 number, you're not going to be able to be an active people manager. And so it's not necessarily the best, but sometimes it's unavoidable to have more reports than that. So, if you think about the overall size of the company, if everyone can manage 5 or 6 people well, right, then as you're getting to dozens of employees, you may have multiple layers of management. And there's definitely additional complexity there. Maybe another like break point where you reach more complexity is where you can't have everyone in the same room. So, another thing that we did in the early days. Sorry?
There's the physical limitation.
Yeah, sure. In the early days, Zoom maybe changes this a little bit, but you can have an infinite number of people on a Zoom call, but they all can't participate. So this was kind of like when we grew beyond 10 or 15 people. In the earliest days, everyone literally worked in the same room. We would have weekly all hands meetings with everybody there. We'd go around the table and everyone would talk about what they were working on. That's a really, it's a lovely period of time where you've got lots of operating advantages that I'm not sure if people recognize when they're going through it. It's really easy to keep people aligned and on the same page. It's also really easy for people to have trust. Everyone else at the company, and so things can happen really quickly. You can all move in coordination with one another very, very well. It's kind of like if everyone's rowing in the same boat. It's pretty easy to get those rowers to all go in the same direction and the same to be synchronized with one another. If you spread that out to we're going to have 6 or 7 different boats, and by the way, those boats are going to have different objectives at different times, but we all need to stay loosely coordinated. Well, all of a sudden, you've got a whole bunch of different challenges on your hands.
Okay. And did the fact that you had a live product in market, which came a little bit later, change the nature of what it was like to manage the company?
Yes, I think so. Pre-launch, the work is largely project based, and you can track your progress based on like milestones in accomplishing that project or the set of projects. But you don't have a lot of data that you can use to measure your progress. You don't have a lot of metrics yet. As soon as you have a product in market, you can measure how that product is performing. You're receiving feedback from your users. You also have more obligations as well if the product goes down or something like that. And so the nature of the work does change. And I think you can begin to manage the business in a much more quantitative, much more scientific way once you have a real product in market that's generating some results.
One of the things I also want to ask about is your own personal administrative needs, and whether at any point did you hire an executive assistant, a chief of staff, offload scheduling? What were the points in which you created CEO support as a function? Maybe they were too early or too late.
As a general matter, if you can delegate something to someone and they can do it 80% as well as you should think about doing so. And a big part of your journey as the CEO is to replace yourself from the responsibilities that you take on in the early days. I mentioned that I had some insight into the legal and regulatory aspects of our business, but early on I recognized I wasn't the appropriate person to be handling those things. So although I might have done, I did a stint as our original general counsel, pretty quickly we brought on real professionals that, maybe some of them had similar training to me, but they could have the right scope of responsibility to do justice to those aspects of the business. So if you're, a CEO or a founder and you're writing code in the early days, there is a point where you need to delegate that and start focusing more on the more strategic or higher level architectural, et cetera, decisions that you need to make. So you're always trying to delegate and scale yourself by doing less, by giving things up to other people that can do them, as well or better than you. Your time is also extremely important. And I see a lot of founders mismanage this. Your own time as a CEO is highly leveraged. There's a lot of things that only you can do, or that you can do better than other people at the company because of your title, because of the additional information that you have, whatever it may be. And you really want that potent resource of your time to be used to its best possible use. And so I really rigorously manage what I spend my time on, always asking myself if I'm spending my time on the most important things for the company. It can be fun to have lots of people that want your time. And if you get to this point as a CEO, you can spend your days any way that you want. There's going to be no lack of things to do, people who will spend an hour with you, and people inviting you to do stuff, asking you to do different things. There's a ton of value in learning to say no and going back to that prioritization, because ultimately, if you're not using your time for the most important things, you're not doing justice to the business. You're in fact doing a significant disservice to the business. That even means saying no to investors from time to time. Right? You have to think about, investors will invite you to all kinds of different things that you can do, opportunities to network and talk to other companies and so on. And those things can be important, but you know better than anyone what's most important for your business at a given time. And so you always
interviews in the middle of the day. I get it.
Yep. Right. There's a reason that you invested in 2016 and it's 2022 and this is the first time we're doing something like this. I finally have the time to be able to do it. Or you didn't invite me until now. That's really important. In terms of hiring like administrative staff, that's a question that kind of relates to your company's resources. I actually waited quite a while before hiring an executive assistant. I did that just within the last year. And that's because, I've always kind of prided myself of someone who's as being someone who's pretty efficient and like self-sufficient. And I developed my own workflows and processes for managing my calendar and so on. And I was able to do it effectively without the need for help. And so, I always made the trade-off of, well, we could use that headcount somewhere else that's going to move the product forward or, enhance the business. But I will say now that I have an executive assistant, it provides me with a lot of leverage. And my executive assistant does a tremendous job in keeping kind of all the trains running as the business has gotten more complex.
And did you have like an office manager, anybody else like that, or chief of staff who was generally administrative but not specifically for you?
Sure. Yeah. And, a lot of administrative duties should be delegated to other people. So I think there are administrative things that fall to a finance team if you have one. There are administrative things that fall to the people team. Sometimes there's a business operations function, which is sort of like a person or maybe part of a person's time in the early days where they're thinking about making the company run the right way. And so, there are kind of maybe administrative type things that can be done by that person. If you have a physical space that requires management, then, some sort of an office manager can make sense. But, in these early days, you want every hire to go really far. And so I always liked where we could create hybrid roles or where people could do multiple things at the same time. And so we had a lot of different people that maybe had other functional responsibilities that also took on some of these duties in the early days.
So Joel's asked a question that relates to something that I was actually thinking about asking when you said it. When you're doing one-on-ones, you were asking people for what their priorities are, kind of what they're working on, is anything getting in the way, all of this sort of stuff. But it didn't sound like you spent a lot of time asking about the how or getting in the weeds of reviewing their work or anything else like that. Um, where do you decide, if anywhere, that it's important for you to dive in somewhere to just double down and make sure, like, this thing really needs to be done right, and I have some expertise, and I'm gonna spend a little more time on product here or a little more time on the marketing message than I normally would. Is that just a function of like where your skill set is, or is it about company priority? Or maybe
There
you
seems to
try
be,
and avoid it
yeah,
altogether?
there seems to be a pattern in the way that I answer these questions, which is I'm going to start with a big macro principle and then I'll work my way down again. So another one, which is going to be true across all the different stages, is that you have a unique you have a unique and privileged position as a CEO. You have a little bit of a superpower, which is granted to you by virtue of your role. And for folks that are watching this that are already, CEOs, founders of early stage companies, it's important that you recognize this superpower because that will allow you to tap into it when it's required. You sit at the best nexus of all of the information that affects your company. You have more information coming to you than anyone else in the business. And that information is likely coming from a variety of different interesting vantage points. So you have information coming to you from everybody that you have internally, the people who are reporting into you, your co-founders or leadership team, and so on. You have information coming to you from all your other stakeholders, your investors, your board of directors, if you have one. You have information coming to you from your larger network, business partners, people in the industry, folks that you've gotten to know over time, from the press, and probably others. A huge part of your job is taking in as much of that information as possible, synthesizing it into something that makes sense from this huge, unruly amount of information that you have, and then communicating that information back out in an organized, synthesized, and ideally simple fashion. But at any given time, you know more than anybody else about what's going on with your company. And it doesn't matter if the people reporting to you have much more experience than you do. Everybody who reports to me at this point has far more experience than I do. They're further along in their careers, more accomplished in their areas of expertise. And so you might think, well, what do I even say in these one-on-ones? What business do I have telling these people what to do? What you have to recognize is they're never going to have all the information that you have. And so you need to be able to communicate all of the context to those people that put them in a position where they can effectively do their job. Now, because you have that information, you will have a more keen sense than maybe anyone else of what is most important to your company. And you need to follow that understanding and shape your behaviors based off of it. And so if you have a product launch or a press article or a pitch to a partner or sales materials or whatever it may be that you know is especially important, then like I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty as a CEO and get involved with those kinds of things. While delegation is important, you really need to build systems to be able to trust but verify the work of your team. And as you verify by double clicking on something and learning more about the how, as you do that and the outcome is favorable, the team is doing the right thing, they're getting it, they're producing high quality work, well, you can check less and less and less. And where businesses really accelerate is when you build that kind of trust. And not just at your level, but at multiple levels in the organization as it gets larger. If you can trust that everybody knows what they're doing and will execute at a high level, well, then everybody can start moving really fast.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I want to be conscious of your time, and certainly if anybody else has questions in the chat, feel free to dive in. But I have two other things that I want to ask about. One is about dealing with investors over time and your role as essentially the head of investor relations and how that has changed and how like between seed and series A and growth and beyond, how your investor interfacing role has changed and how you use them, and what time you spend to them in the communication side of it.
Going back to, the earlier part of our conversation, the CEO typically is the person that leads those first meetings with investors when you're pitching your company. And you should know that from the moment you open your mouth and communicate with an investor, that's the beginning of what, if you're successful, will be a very long-term relationship. And further, in the early stages, if you're lucky enough to have folks invest in your company, they are largely investing in you. And I mean, some early stage investors would say that that is the majority of the decision that they make in the early stages. And they're investing in the relationship with you as well. You should also know that that your investors end up being some of the most important long-term advocates for your business. They could be advocates in the form of additional follow-on investment, right? They could actually support the company financially at multiple stages in the future. Or they could bring in other later stage investors that they know that can financially support the company. You want to build trust and credibility with your investors over time, such that they understand what's going on with the company. They have the ability to help if things aren't going well or if you're experiencing problems, so that they can kind of understand what you're doing and build confidence in you over time, based on your execution and your approach to building the business and being a responsible, reasonable operator with good judgment and strategic insight and so forth. Some people think of investor updates or investor relations as a chore. I can promise you that if done the right way, you'll get back much more than what you put in to keeping your investors appraised of your progress. So since our very first investment from Charlie and the other early investors in Petal, we've sent regular investor updates. At the beginning, we did it monthly, and then we moved to quarterly, and we continue to a more extensive quarterly update. We continue on a quarterly cadence, plus other interactions, with the board, on an ad hoc basis as things come up, et cetera. That's important for all the things that I mentioned. And I would also say that taking a step back, I mentioned earlier the power of synthesizing all that information you have access to as a CEO. You've got to synthesize. You have to practice that synthesis when you're communicating out to investors that maybe haven't heard from you in a month or a few months, have lots of other portfolio companies, are jumping from one context to the next. They're not as involved in all the detail as you are. And so you have to be able to boil down everything that's going on to the most important kind of key things. I've always found that producing those materials, producing that investor update or the presentation for the board, that always sharpens my own thinking. And actually, afterwards, although it's work to do it, afterwards, there's other value that comes from that, that you can then use in internal communications and operations for your business, or just in advancing your own thinking about what's most important.
Gotcha. Last question. You're now working for a 200-person company that is, beyond the point of, is this thing a thing and does the product work and is going to be around? And obviously I'm sure you feel like there's still lots and lots of work left to do, but it has achieved some level of stability. As you think about your own lifestyle and working hours and all of that sort of stuff, how has that shifted? Are there times where you feel like it has become more acceptable to yourself or more comfortable personally to like leave the office at a regular at a more normal time? Did that sort of shift, and did you have to be intentional about saying like, look, there's nothing more I can do today except focus on the rest of my life and take care of myself and all of that sort of stuff? I'm curious about that development as a CEO as the business has matured.
Right. So my macro point here is that the your behaviors create the culture of your business. You can write down the core tenets of your culture, and you should. We did that before we ever raised money. And Charlie, I think I remember actually, it might have been before you committed to invest. I shared with you the main kind of tenets of our early culture at that point. You should write those things down, but know that it's your behaviors and not what you've written that will ultimately shape the norms and the culture of your company. And so if you aspire to build a company where people have balance in what they do and they work in a sustainable way and they don't burn out in their work, you've got to role model it. Because if you don't take a vacation, no matter what your policy says, people on your team are not going to feel comfortable taking a vacation. So understand that what you do is going to set the tone for everyone else. It's kind of point one. Second point is, look, we're having this conversation 7 years after I started working on this business. Any successful outcome in doing something like this takes a long time. And so you have to recognize that you must be sustainable to succeed. So I think, these are high stakes games that we play. There's money involved, there's life-changing outcomes involved, not just financially, but for your users, for the impact of your product on the world. But because things are so serious and because the upside potential in these things is so great, it can lead people to think, well, I must work in the most extreme fashion that I can physically tolerate. And I'm not going to lie to you, there are times when you actually might have to put in that kind of work, leading up to something that's really critical. But nobody can run that way constantly, or you will burn it out and you won't be able to make it the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years plus that's necessary to really build something of value and substance and scale. So it's got to be sustainable over time. Going back to some of the same principles about how important your own time is, I really key into what gives me energy. When am I going to perform at the highest level? When I need to take a break? Gosh, if you start to be burnt out as a CEO, you can cause real damage to your company because you're doing so many important things. Like if you're not in it and thinking clearly and energized, you'll cause all kinds of collateral damage that you might not even see. So self-care is really important, even when you're doing something that's super intense. And if you look at high performance athletes, for instance, their recovery time is just as important as their practice time. You kind of have to take a similar approach with how you treat yourself.
Well, listen, Jason, I don't want to be one of those investors that constantly takes you away from everything that's going on. We'll check back in and see where you are 7 years from now, and see if we need to rewrite this whole thing. But listen, super proud of everything that you guys have accomplished at Petal. Super psyched about all that's left to work on. Congrats on your success up until this point, and really, really appreciate you spending the time and sharing all the stuff with us today.
I appreciate it. Happy to share. And, a lot of these lessons we've learned the hard way, doing lots of things wrong over the years and learning from those mistakes. So, if any of this is helpful to folks that are watching, that's very gratifying for me.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Jason. Have a good day,
Take
everyone.
care. Bye-bye.